Watch Sir Keir Starmer appear to deflect the question when grilled over whether he breached lockdown rules.
I know that, like everyone in the House, the Prime Minister is an honourable member. On that basis, can he repeat his assurances that all rules were followed while the country was in Tier 4 lockdown in December 2020, not just by him, but as his team as well, but also his voice coach, Leona Mellinger?
Mr. Speaker, in December 2020, I was in my office working on the expected Brexit deal. With my team, we had to analyse the deal as it came in at speed, prepare and deliver a live statement at speed on one of the most important issues for our country in recent years. That's what I was doing. What were they doing? Suitcases of booze into Downing Street, partying and fighting, vomiting up the walls, leaving the cleaners to remove red wine stains. That's the difference. I was working, they were partying.
Christopher Hope told Martin Daubney questions remained over whether seeing his voice coach was classed as key work during the lockdown.
And it's fair to say, once again, Kemi Badenoch had the chance to put a glove on Starmer's chin. She didn't even lead on this topic, but a backbencher did have a pop at him. Tell us what happened. I think he's feeling the pinch here.
So weekly, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, gets 6 questions to Keir Starmer. You'd have thought, given the mess which Boris Johnson got into over whether or not there were parties in Downing Street, whether he knew about them, whether indeed cake was consumed at one party or not, because that meant it was a party or wasn't a party. She had 6 questions, but she chose not to ask about that. She asked one on the Chagos Islands, a lot about oil and gas, and she briefly talked about the issue of this voice coach. To remind viewers and listeners, 24th of December 2020, we're all in tears. Tier 4 in London, Tier 3 elsewhere, in Brighton notably. There was a meeting to prepare Sir Keir Starmer to give a response to the Brexit deal announced by Boris Johnson. Rachel Reeves was in the room, Keir Starmer, Sky camera, BBC camera, a tech team, and this key worker, this voice coach, came up from Brighton, from Tier 3 to Tier 4. The question is, was she able to, was she allowed to?
2 tiers, Keir, before he's even called.
Now, the question was asked by a different Tory backbencher, were all rules followed? And it's very important that viewers and listeners listen now to what he had to say.
Can he repeat his assurances that all rules were followed while the country was in Tier 4 lockdown in December 2020, not just by him, but as his team as well, but also his voice coach, Leona Mellinger?
I was in my office working on the expected Brexit deal. With my team, we had to analyse the deal as it came in at speed, prepare and deliver a live statement at speed on one of the most important issues for our country in recent years. That's what I was doing. What were they doing? Suitcases of booze into Downing Street, partying and fighting, vomiting up the walls, leaving the cleaners to remove red wine stains. That's the difference. I was working, they were partying.
Now, what's really important for viewers and listeners to understand is at the dispatch box, Sir Keir Starmer wouldn't say all rules were followed. However, behind the scenes, his press team do tell us that all rules were followed, but he wouldn't say it at the dispatch box, and that's why it's interesting and is a story. And just finally, Kemi Badenoch, although she wouldn't say in House of Commons, her press secretary said that the Metropolitan Police should investigate this matter.
The Prime Minister is also in hot water for cancelling local elections.
Lots of concern that this is democracy denied.
Yeah, certainly. So the government's been speaking for months now about effectively trying to unitarise sort of 2 groups of local authorities to avoid duplication of work, so that you basically bring together county councils and district councils. And they've had to make a slightly uncomfortable decision today about which district councils won't be able to sort of have elections in the spring. Now, local elections are usually used as a really key barometer by journalists to be able to test the mood of the country against the government of the day. And you'll remember that under Boris Johnson, certainly, it sort of contributed to that constant drip, drip, drip feel that, support was ebbing away from the Conservatives. And Labour are facing a really uphill battle here. We've seen from the national opinion polls that they're, in some cases, tying with Reform, that the Conservatives are also sort of level pegging, and that support for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in the opinion polls is quite low. So there are questions about why they've decided to take this move, but they say it's just to avoid a duplication of resources.
Now, we do have a map of the local election areas for this May. And this is interesting because this could have some pretty profound consequences, particularly for the Reform Party. If we look at the whole map here, the areas that now won't be having elections: East Sussex, Essex, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, Norfolk, Suffolk, Surrey, Thurrock and West Sussex, all areas, frankly, where the Reform Party is doing relatively well. Might this artificially dampen down the projected national vote share that the Reform Party might get?
Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, looking at that map's really interesting because you can see the areas of the country, particularly sort of coastal regions, where those elections have been called off. And Nigel Farage has been crying foul about this for weeks, suggesting that it's an attempt to deprive people of their right to vote and also deny Reform a chance to sort of prove its mettle and start embedding itself at a much more sort of grassroots local level. They obviously got a very significant share of the vote at the general election nationally, but they only picked up 5 MPs, so they're still a relatively small voice in Parliament. They'd have a much greater power if they could start picking up councillors in local authorities across the country. And there are, I should say, areas where actually councils asked for these elections to be delayed and the government stepped in and said, no, we don't think that's right for you. But actually, it looks as though this isn't necessarily going to hurt the Labour Party the most. The areas that will probably be saved and were due to be elected this year were mostly sort of Conservative held.
So you don't think this is an attempt by Labour to avoid any electoral humiliation?
Well, I mean, it's clear that they are going to have a very difficult set of local elections on polling day in the spring, but I think there are a sort of strong counter-arguments as to why Labour can say they're legitimately trying to do this, but questions will, of course, be asked about how they do it, how they phase it in.
This comes as Labour tank in the polls and Reform's meteoric rise appears to be spooking the Prime Minister.
I was also very much struck by what happened with Nigel Farage. There was one question from the Labour backbenches inviting Keir Starmer to attack Nigel Farage. In my world, that's called a planted question by the whips. They give an easy question to a Labour backbencher, inviting the Prime Minister to have a tilt at the opposition. And the target wasn't for the Tory party, the target was Nigel Farage. And that's because Farage is now riding high in the polls. He's ahead of the Tories in 7 polls. Of course, he topped the YouGov poll this week, Find Out Now last week. It shows to me that finally Labour are turning their fire on Nigel Farage. And in fact, when Farage was called, and he wasn't meant to be called, that was Speaker Lindsay Hoyle picking him out to ask a question. When he was called, he couldn't get his question out. Labour MPs were shouting at him, roaring at him so loudly. That to me shows Labour is worried about Reform UK.
Such an important point there, Chris. You were there in the room, in the press gallery, looking down. Just tell us a bit about what the cacophony was like, because Nigel Farage tried to speak several times, but it seemed like, from my perspective, watching down the line, almost every Labour MP was sort of bellowing at him, not letting him speak, which might not be the best look back home in their constituencies.
Yeah, it never looks great, I think. A lot of what happens in PMQs outside the chamber for viewers at home. I mean, John Bercow, one of his big things he did well, I think, was trying to ensure that MPs remembered how it looks back home, and certainly shouting down someone like that, a party leader with 4 million votes in July, only 5 MPs, but riding high in the polls, will just embolden those who think Nigel Farage is the best thing since sliced bread, and they want to get behind him, and it will just further kind of, I mean, he'll say, I'm outside of this kind of elite Westminster, whatever you call it, outside looking in, and all the establishment want to shout me down. Well, he won't be silenced, all the language which Farage would use in this situation were he here. So he wouldn't mind being shouted down. He kept going and answered his question. But I think fascinating, that we are seeing Labour turning its fire right on Nigel Farage and Reform UK. It's not necessarily a Conservative right-wing psychodrama, as many on the left have thought. It is a problem for Labour as much as the Tory party.